Hello, welcome to this Chillhammer paint along. Today we're going to be painting this horrible creature. Yes. So this is a 90s era orc done by Kev Adams, and just look at the personality in this chap, yeah? He's got such a brilliant expression, and it really works well with that club of his to really convey that intent of giving you one in the face. I love this model. This series of models, in my opinion, are the Apex Orcs design. Now, I'm a big fan of Brian Nelson's like later Hunchbacks, but these ones I feel are really quite special insofar as how they're all unique and different, as well as the fact that they have got this amazing diversity of weapons. So let's get started. Flesh wise, I believe that for models of this era, you really need a bright green that has a lot of that visual power to cut through all of the typically neutral and muted shades that you have on most orc color schemes. So with that in mind, we're going to start with Striking Scorpion Green, which is this really vivid bright green contrast paint. You're going to see that I'll be using a lot of contrast paint in general. This is my preferred method of painting these days, but I like to draw your attention to the way I'll be using these. Instead of drowning the surface in contrast paint, I think I like to favor something of a more controlled approach where we will be playing with the translucency really of the paint a little bit more. And that, just the fact that you can layer over multiple different colors to create quite unique effects really gives you a quick and effective way of painting like large units of these, and you can achieve really quite amazing luminosity on the surface just by varying how you apply this and the strength with which you go for it. That is contrast medium. Yeah, that's usually what I use to cut the Striking Scorpion Green, simply because I very rarely use full strength contrast paint, simply because applying thin down, cut down versions, mixes of the paint, if you will, really allows you to control where the intensity shows on the model. Plus, it allows you to build up volumes a lot more easily. More on that later. Shade wise, we're going to be looking at butane green. This really reinforces that dark green kind of color that we want to have in the recesses, and we'll be applying this also very selectively because, as I mentioned before, we're not going to be drowning the surface of the model in this, just to give us a little bit more options when it comes to approaching how we paint this model. Size 1 Ashley nylon Teflon, whatever they call it, paintbrush. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. Now, so this is our boy, as mentioned before. The first thing we want to do is to make sure that we saturate the brush in water. Take most of it off your wet palette and then go right ahead and mix these two together. Now, the reason why you mix paints with a wet brush is so that it doesn't travel up via capillary action into the ferrule and therefore run the risk of ruining your brush. Now you can see that this is actually quite thin. It's really quite liquid, and so you don't actually need to put a lot of it on your brush at once. So we're going to get started and just block in all of the green areas. Now you're going to have a really bright green, especially when painted over a light undercoat like this. For this particular model, and for most of the models, I think I favor heavily this off-white spray. It's done by a company called Nippon Paint in Singapore, where I am, and it's by a brand called Pylox. Nippon Paint being Nippon Paint being the parent company, Pylox being the exact range of paint, and I believe it's called. Oh, why do I do this offhand? It's pale gray, off gray. Goodness, I can't remember. I'll check it and I'll leave it in the description. But suffice to say, it gives you a really sort of desaturated, muted gray color, and this really helps you achieve a more realistic, a more desaturated result using contrast paints. Now, I just said that we want to go for a nice bright green, and yet I'm talking about the idea of desaturating the colors, right? So you're probably rightly wondering which of the two is it, because it's a little bit hard to understand what I mean unless you see this in person. This paint undercoat, this undercoat color, I believe has a bit of green in it, a little bit of gray green. It tends to enhance the sort of realism of contrast paint. When applied over like straight white, I feel contrast paint has a tendency to kind of look a little bit neon, a little bit fluorescent because of just how vivid the pigments are. When applied over a slight off-white like this, you have a tendency to have something that looks a little bit more like it could exist in the real world. Yeah. So the equivalent of this color, which I use to touch up, is Vallejo Silver Gray. Right, so that's the one. This color is a really close analog to the spray color, and it results in, so it really allows me to go back in and touch up errors and clean up mistakes and so on the surface using that color. And once you have your contrast paint laid over it, I find that it's really quite hard to distinguish distinguish which areas had been like touched up with that Vallejo color as opposed to the original unblemished spray. So as you can see, I'm applying this color all over the surface. Just how cut down it is allows a lot more of the original base coat to show through, and already we're having quite an interesting looking result. Now, when it comes to applying contrast paint, I like to load my brush fairly liberally, but not pick up so much paint that the brush is basically soaking wet. If you look closely at the brush tip here, you can see, is it in focus? Perhaps not. But yeah, the idea is that it is definitely carrying quite a bit of paint, but it's also not completely like sopping wet. There's no drop of paint concentrated at the tip, for example, that could hit the model and fan out, creating a huge mess. Now, not exactly rocket science, it's just a little bit of practice with the sort of fluid dynamics of the way the paint works on the surface. Can really make a big difference to the final result. Another way of looking at it, of course, is just the idea that you apply it liberally, let it kind of settle for a few seconds, but not dry, settle but not dry on the surface, level out, and then go back in and wick off the excess. So that gives a really good result as well. And we're closing in on what I consider to be a good finish for this. Yeah, so I'm going to bring in the light a bit, pardon me, just to make that a little bit more obvious. Yeah, there we go. So you can see that there is a bit of a pool on his forehead. Let's try to wick off some of the excess there, channel it to where it really should be, which is around the edges. Oops, so good idea to keep it in frame. Sorry, don't mind me, I'm going to adjust my cradle. Yeah, so sometimes it's going to be hard to get rid of a large quantity of paint that has built up. So a quick brush over with your finger really does wonders to fixing this. Of course, you have to do this while the paint is still wet and not started to set up yet. But yeah, a quick wipe in time. A little bit like what artists do with charcoal, right? They have a tendency to use their fingers to blend on the surface. You can do that with contrast paint as well over a surface like this. Yeah, so move the paint around, but don't move it excessively after it started to dry. And if you see a bit of a disaster like forming with paint blobbing up where you don't want it to be, act quickly and nip it in the bud. So we have got the beginnings of a fairly nice, clean, luminous undercoat. Well, undercoat, base coat essentially, plus the beginning of a bit of shading. Now, I would encourage all of us to get out of the habit of flooding the surface with shades, right? Shade paints like washes or glade or shading, and instead look for areas where a little bit more of this color, a little bit more intensity, I suppose, could be reintroduced into the model, into the areas that really need it the most, so such as the recesses. So what I'm doing is, it's not even fully dry yet, right? But what I'm going to do is to go in and add small amounts of shade I hope you can see this. Essentially where I feel it's needed, and this really helps to reinforce the volumes of the surface. When we're talking about about miniature painting, volumes really refers to the idea that, you know, as a 3D surface, you've got some areas which sort of dome upwards towards you. Those are the areas that you should endeavor to get lighter, whereas the little cracks and crevices, those are the areas where you want to make it a little bit darker. So this model is starting to look pretty good in my opinion, and already I feel that this gets us to a stage where you could have it on the tabletop en masse and it would still look pretty good. Of course, what we want to do is to take this a little step further, and that's where the built-on green will come in. So now, because the idea is to get these models done in one session, or every model done in one sitting, we're going to move on to the next color. We're going to have to be a little bit careful because some of this stuff is still wet, clearly, but it does require the time to dry. So let's move on to, where is a safe place to paint? Perhaps his sort of leather furry jerkin that he's got on. So when it comes to colors like this, I feel that you want to be very wary of how you paint brown on a lot of these models. You want to choose a color that is fairly light and cut it again with medium, so that gives you a little bit more control over the end result. When you use contrast paint and add medium to it, you'll find that there are all sorts of colors hidden away hidden away by just the intensity of the colors out of the bottle. When you cut them with medium, you'll see that you can get quite a range of interesting shades. For example, Nazdreg yellow, when cut with contrast medium, really starts to have lots of interesting yellows in the recesses. As the name suggests, it starts to look a lot more yellow, whereas the shading is more of a brown, kind of like a reddish brown, and that makes your model a lot more visually interesting as you go into layering this on the surface. So the first pass, right, that I put on models, typically I like to just try to achieve, sorry, I'm going to adjust this a little bit. I just want to try to achieve kind of the relief on the surface. I want to just see the textures come out a little bit more when I apply it, and then the actual sort of curvatures of the surface, the volumes, as I mentioned, we will enhance by coming back into shade carefully over the surface. And the reason why I like to do this via a targeted wash is because it gives you a great deal more control over whatever the gravity is feeling like doing that day, which is really what a lot of the contrast paint marketing tells you. You apply it and then you just let it level on its own, which is great and all, but I think there comes a point in every painter's sort of career, so to speak, where they want to start taking their paint jobs to the next level. And to do this, I would argue that you would need to give yourself a little bit more control over how the paint like pulls up and where you want to emphasize, as opposed to just letting gravity do all the work. Now, that is starting to look pretty good. I haven't painted this brown all the way up to the edges because I'm very much wary of some of the areas where, you know, kind of it's still a little bit wet, right? And to be fair, this is a completely self-imposed thing. And this is a mistake of my own, a challenge of my own making, because I'm the one saying that I've got to finish this in one setting. But you know what? I think we're going to work with it. We're going to be just a little bit more cagey and careful. Try not to let it run in and create a gigantic mess. And the truth is, those areas where the fur comes right up against the orc flesh, those are the areas where typically we'll be applying our second coat anyway to shade down. So I think that's going to work out just right for us. So now that I've applied the first layer of color to sort of define some of the textures on the surface, you'll find that there's not a lot of variation in terms of defining the volumes on the surface. So for example, this rectangular block of shoulder where he's got a kind of a horrible hump growing out of his back, that area is a raised area, and then there's a kind of ridge going down the center of his back. Well, not down the center, but at where his waist would be, I suppose, where his belt would be. And then below that, there is another section below. So this is where we'll be coming in with the same paint to redefine how we view these volumes by adding more intensity to the recesses. But anyway, let's let this dry somewhat, and then we can move on to another color, because like I said, we're going to be painting at a fairly fast clip. I find that when it comes to painting quickly, there are a few little things that you can do to make your painting more precise. What I like to do is to get into the habit of painting in vertical lines, top to bottom. So I don't try to force myself to paint horizontally, move my brush horizontally across the surface unless I'm doing highlights. But then again, those I would do when I'm trying to be fairly careful. When it comes to applying contrast paint, what I like to do is to just go top to bottom and master the precision of that top to bottom stroke. Also, a painting handle does wonders for the stability of the miniature. Plus, you can place your last digit against it as a rest while you work on it like that. This really allows you to keep your back straight and gives you better posture, which means that overall you'll be a lot more stable when you paint. Yeah? Okay, cool. So this blob of paint that I just dropped down, right, it's got no label on it. And the reason for that is because it's a custom mix. So what this is a mixture of Blood Angels Red and Gryphhound Orange. And what I find is that this gives me a more visually interesting mix. Now, I've already diluted this because I use this mix a lot. So you'll find that when I apply over the surface, it gives you a nice rich red in the recesses, but it already comes preloaded with orange highlights, which I find quite pleasing to look at on the surface. So you can sort of see that's what the red looks like. I'm going to go down and define this area down there as before. The green is taking a little bit longer to dry because we did put in a lot of contrast medium. So what we will do is let it take its time, settle in, and we'll get a better result for it, not to worry. So slowly work it in. And one of the things that I really love about contrast paint is just the idea that when you apply contrast paint to a surface like this, and then you have it, when you get to the point where it adjoins another color, so for example where the red contacts the green, if you let it overlap slightly, ever so slightly, right, you have a combination of green and red on the surface. And as we know, green and red makes brown, which is a really good color to sort of have that natural barrier between the two colors, a little bit of separation. In the old days, what they would advocate in like White Dwarf, for example, would be to take a bit of black paint of some description, usually Chaos Black, for example, which was the go-to black in the day, and then apply that as a black line in between two surfaces. This is fine, except it's another step, plus it has a tendency to kind of come off as very, very thick, and therefore the model ended up looking like almost cell shaded. In addition, black doesn't really have a character of its own, really. So what you would have is essentially a very desaturated shadow, an intense desaturated shadow between where two colors should be. Case in point, if you have a yellow tunic, right, bordering a white say section of cloth, should the shadow between them be black? I don't think so. In my opinion, a sort of neutral brown, a dark brown, maybe what Games Workshop used to call Scorch Brown, or today called Rhinox Hide, I think, would be a far more natural looking choice to border those two colors. Black just feels really intense and maybe a touch too strong, in my opinion. So yeah, of course your mileage will vary, and of course your preferences should dictate the way you paint. But personally, I find it a little bit too strong, and therefore kind of, yeah, looking a little bit too artificial and almost, yeah, like I said, cell shaded, a bit like hand drawn artwork, comic book art. Not the kind of look that I'm trying to achieve. Okay, so that's the red of the club drawn in, and you can sort of see that, for the raised areas, it has almost like an orange tinge to it. Now, in this era of Warhammer miniatures, you'll find that, a lot of bright colors get used. simply because they help the miniature pop from the page. Now, from interviews that I've been watching on YouTube, and there are lots of wonderful interviews, as a lot of the pioneers of Games Workshop from this era are now sharing their experiences, working in the industry. What they were saying is that it's the camera and work and the photo process that really takes a lot of the vibrancy out of the colors, and therefore they tended to overcompensate for this by making models extremely, like almost eye-achingly bright. And the result is when you actually take a photo, it desaturates it slightly, and the end result is something that's a bit more palatable to the eye, at least. Now, in my opinion, it looks equally bright, right? It looks insanely bright even back then when I was a kid. So I don't know what to make of that, but could be the case. Either way, there's something really charming about the intensity of the brightness, and that's something that I'm going to try to emulate in this miniature, as well as those moving forward. Yeah, especially when it gets to models like models that have a little bit more of an interesting palette, like say chaos models have lots of opportunity to explore, particularly the demons, which are really vibrant and bright and really interesting to look at. So I'm coming back in with the previous puddle, the little puddle of Nazdreg yellow, and I'm starting to add a little bit more volume to the areas, as well as picking up on the parts which I didn't cover fully because of proximity to wet paint. And yeah, a little bit more over the back here, and I think we're starting to look like we're in a good place. Yeah, so there we go. I think we're moving along at a fair clip. Let me just catch this little area over here. Yep, oops, got a little bit on his hand. So now on the subject of mistakes, part of the reason why I want to show you painting a model in one sitting is because I think it forces me to come to grips with the fact that I make mistakes a lot, right? In the past, when I've done like painting lessons, given people painting lessons, I've had a tendency to subconsciously fix errors on the sly, hoping that people wouldn't see. And I don't think that's great for learning, really. What we need to learn is sometimes how we fix errors, and hiding them away by clever editing, or by just an unwillingness to go into those areas is not the way to do it. Miniature painting is kind of messy sometimes, and it can be really daunting for people starting out, for new people who are just essentially developing a very new complex series of skills. Yeah, maybe this will inspire you to give it a try, because it really isn't that hard, in my opinion, once you get the fundamentals down. So we're going to move on to a little bit of silver, and for this, the Vallejo Model Air range is Apex stuff, right? This is literally like, this silver paints on like a dream, it covers like a dream, and when you apply Games Workshop shades over it, it looks amazing. So I'm going to take a little bit of this silver, pop it over here. As always, we're keeping our paints fairly organized because we will need to come back to these over time. And you might be wondering, there's not a lot of silver on this model, is there? Oh, no silver paint came out there. Sorry, let's have a bit more. There we go, much better. Yeah, so if you look at the model, not a lot of silver is on the surface at all, right? It's mostly these like little spikes, which I choose to interpret as silver. I think they would stand out really nicely if done in silver, as opposed to, say, like bone or something. You also notice that I've kept the top like sort of blank, and that's because back in the day, a lot of these models kind of had wood grain, a separation between the bark and the wood grain, so you could go in and do like a brown coat over the top, and that would give you something more to look at on the top of the weapon, as well as sort of draw your eye to that area. Very clever stuff, actually. A lot of these older models I loved a bit, simply because I feel like, considering that these models were not sculpted digitally, they were instead done by hand, your sculptor would actually be constrained by the amount of real estate on the miniature, right? The size of the miniatures themselves were of course constrained by the fact that they were in blister packs back then, not really in boxes. So the blister pack had to hold a number of these units, and I believe for a core unit troop type like this orc, you would have, I think, 4 to a blister, and 4 of these little guys would have to fit into that blister pack. So that's not a lot of real estate to squeeze miniatures into. So there was a tendency to be very judicious with the use of space. The details had to be bold and visually able to be picked out easily even at a distance. So there was a tendency not to overcrowd the surface with too much detail. In addition, there was a tendency to not, because these were sculpted by hand and not digitally, you couldn't sort of enlarge or shrink down details as you needed. Everything had to be sculpted 1:1 at full size, and therefore a lot of the sculptors went for a less is more approach. Even when it comes to the characters, which are, some of them are just really nicely detailed, lots of stuff going on the surface, but compared to today's miniatures, they look fairly restrained. Even when you get to awesome character models like Nagash, for example, the old Gary Morley sculpt, which I might want to do, although I doubt my ability to do that in one sitting. It's an awesome model though, I kind of want to work on it. Anyway, yeah, so you'll find that a lot of those models, they have fairly restrained details compared to the miniatures of today. The amount of detail crawling on a Chaos model, especially the 40k ones today, pretty stunning. Although I would argue they get a little bit bleh to paint because there's just so much to do. Okay, so our miniature is starting to look quite colorful, which I am very pleased about. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to do that lower little bit of loincloth. And now the trick with doing brown is to not have mid browns, right? You want to have the upper yellow range of colors, because those are visually warm and attractive. And then after that, you go for the deeper red-brown range. Ideally, you would avoid that kind of nondescript middle neutral brown, because those colors tend to vanish on the model, and not unless you're trying to make it sort of visually recede and not take up too much real estate as far as the look of the model is concerned, right? So let's go with this. This is Gore Grunter fur, sorry, not flesh. And this is one of the few colors that I like to use without dilution, simply because that red-brown has great intensity and it naturally seems to pull away from the surface quite nicely already without much extra coaxing or dilution. So this includes all of the areas that I want to have in shadow underneath his overhang, his nether regions. So these ones I will do in this mercifully muted color, so that it doesn't become a major feature of the overall color scheme. Overall, we want our eye to be drawn by his face and skin. We want our eye to be drawn by his glorious bright red weapon. This color can stand to recede into obscurity a little bit and not kind of take pride of place or center stage for the overall color scheme. So there we go. Okay, so I believe our green is mostly dry. Let's see. Now there's a funny little space there, and I imagine that this little window would look pretty good in green actually, simply because it reinforces the logic of his outfit. It looks like a vest. So let's do that. Let's put some green in there because I think that would make the most sense. There we go. Yeah. So a little bit more on here, on his hand. And then we can go into a little bit of targeted shading to bring out a little bit more contrast where it matters. As you can see, I'm already starting to apply a little bit more of this striking scorpion green where I think it basically needs it. So for example, where two different colors join, right? And also to reinforce the shapes of the muscles. in my opinion, you can paint a model entirely this way without resorting to a highlight, which would save you a lot of time, right? Especially if you're doing like large units of horde troops like orcs. You need like a million of these things. So the idea is that by choosing a fast and effective method of painting like this, you can get them to a tabletop standard pretty well, very quickly, and then you can come back in and apply the highlights as you will later. So at the top, well, maybe let's do a little bit more than Nazdreg yellow, but let's cut it down a little bit further with a bit more water. So that makes it really pale and chill looking, like that, kind of almost like a bone color. Yeah. Okay, cool. That's looking pretty good. I'm gonna add a little bit more darkness in the recesses. We don't really need to have our eye drawn to that area, and I think that's looking pretty good. So now let's move on to our shade color, which in this case is Midtone green. Midtone green has a very different personality to this green, like striking scorpion green. So this really allows us to sort of bring out some more of the character of his face. Yeah. And then as you can see, I'm not washing it over the surface. I'm choosing to apply it where I feel it would benefit the model best. Because really what you're doing is you're creating a new degree of shade, a new intensity of shadow with this color. We don't want to be coating over all of our previous work because that would be a bit of a waste, right? Applying this over the surface, which is again it's translucent, so it doesn't take over the model entirely, but it allows us to define a new level of depth. So especially where I'm painting his ankles now, you can sort of see that applying this actually immediately creates a much more intense shadow, in my opinion, where we would need it. Yeah, especially around where it joins with that kneecap armor. Seems to it's got a plate. It's got a pair of, what are those things called? The thing, the boss. They look like shield bosses. Maybe there was the remnants of a previous battle. He appears to have a pair of shield bosses like worn on his, like strapped to his knees as kneecaps. It's very ramshackle and very orky, which is great. Now in the game, orcs are a really interesting faction, right? Orcs and goblins, kind of wonderful actually, because they've got so much diversity. They're really a collection of various tribes coming together for mutual benefit, which is to run around raiding other races. So they're really cool in that in this era, which is 4th edition, the edition I played when I was a lot younger, they had various tribes coming together, and they were all kind of unique and had a very special, different way of waging war. So for example, you had common orcs, like these guys, who were mostly nomadic tribes, comprised primarily of just lots of foot infantry. They would be supported by a stone thrower or two. They would typically have units of boar boys, which were their cavalry. So a very balanced force, but not particularly stellar in any real way. Then you would have night goblins, which had a completely different style of fighting, wherein their infantry was a lot less reliable and less capable of going toe to toe with the enemies. But they did have a lot of like wonder troops, like Wonderwaffen, like fanatics and trolls and so on, all of which added a lot of flavor to the army. Then you had the savage orcs, which were really interesting because they had frenzy, so they're a lot less likely to do exactly what you wanted them to do. They had a tendency to sort of run amok amongst the enemy, but if equipped correctly, they can do an absolute ton of damage. If allowed to close in good order and engage the enemy's best units. For the most part, though, I kind of felt that orcs were not the best at close combat, which is what you would imagine they would want to do. Almost every edition after 4th edition, orcs actually got better in close combat. first by giving them things like like choppers, and like the ability to call a walk, which help them move towards the enemies faster, so they wouldn't get shot to pieces quite as much. Orcs were, even though their primary trait, I suppose, was toughness, which is their only remarkable stat, right? Because in every other way, they're pretty much bog standard humans. The only noteworthy stat was a toughness of 4, which in the big scheme of things wasn't great. Dwarves also had the toughness of 4, plus they had better weapon skill, and they had better armor and better leadership, and dwarves were better overall. And when you got to those awful elves, they were like better weapon skill, better armor, lots of other benefits, including like really good magic and so on. So orcs were kind of left behind a little bit, I feel. So what they did have was numbers, but yeah, quantity is a quality of its own, I know, but at the same time, when you're facing down like elite dwarves packed into a narrow corridor between two hills, sometimes you really do need quality to just remain quality. And quantity doesn't solve all problems, unfortunately. Anyway, so we are getting along to a point where I think we want to let things dry a little bit. You can still see the wet spots where I've continued to define the shading a little bit more on his jerkin. I think what we're going to do is do something that I love to do whenever I paint miniatures, which is to take a base break. Now, as you can see, this model has been assembled and popped into a round base. I know, heresy, but I think the solution to models that can't rank up is to simply put them on round bases. And then that really allows you to rotate them in their slot within the movement tray, right? So that solves that problem. I tend to use Agros dunes over this sandy surface. It's just sand that's glued onto the surface and sealed with PVA, but I like to take a step in this direction while I let other things dry. And also when I'm not doing a one session paint, I like to end a session by applying paint onto the base, because it's something easy and not so taxing on my eyes, and a good way to end the session quickly and effectively. And trust me, when you've let this dry fully, because it does take a long time to dry anyway, right? This is solid contrast paint, Agros dunes undiluted over the surface. You'll find that when this is fully dry, it really is quite a morale boost, because suddenly the model, even if you're clearly not finished, right, this morale boost really makes you feel like you've done quite a lot to progress the model along. And it feels good because painting is not a fast process, and sometimes painting models you get a bit lost in the details, and it's easy to get demoralized, right? So I like to do this, let it dry while I work on other things. Yeah, there comes a point in almost every painting session you find where you're kind of like sagging a little bit, because there's just so much little details that perhaps you didn't account for, or you're starting to make mistakes and your eyes are getting tired. So that's the perfect activity to do, painting the base, which is just really easy and straightforward. So there we go. Our orc is starting to look pretty good. All right. And I think I would want to is it time to go in with some highlights? Perhaps so. Let's do that. So for highlights, I like to take a little bit of Vallejo Ice Yellow, which is this stuff, or its equivalent, I suppose, which is Dorn Yellow for Citadel range. And I like to take a little bit of our previously diluted Striking Scorpion Green, giving it a bit of a mix because it tends to settle, and then putting it into that. So that's our highlight. Right? At the same time, I'm probably going to switch to a slightly better brush. You'll find that contrast kills your brushes quite badly, even if you use the loading of water to sort of make sure that it doesn't get too saturated and wick up into the furrow via capillary action. So I'm going to apply some highlights where I think they are necessary. And because this is a nice sort of, this model doesn't really have hard lines on it, on the flesh at all, just a lot of nice curvy surfaces. I think it's just as simple as emphasizing the center of each muscle group, a bit like that. And then this really helps your model to stand out on the surface. So let's makes it look a lot cleaner. Which, you know, sometimes when you apply contrast paint, it does sometimes flow where you don't want it to. And doing it this way really allows you to sort of clean up the surface to make the details read a little bit better. So it's coming along. Right, and then the next step is to go a lot brighter with this and put this on extremities like his knuckles. Thankfully their hands are quite huge, so picking these out shouldn't be too problematic. And what I found is that once you have that line of bright points going down the knuckles of the hand, your eye is naturally drawn to that, and the model starts to become a lot more eye-catching as a result. A little bit of brighter pale green or a pale green mix in the center of each of these muscle groups, and that sort of serves as the point that your eye is drawn to, like this, and a bit on the fingers as well, bearing in mind that the knuckles should still be the brightest point. Center of his forehead and that kind of T-zone around his face. You've got the cheeks, not part of the T-zone of course, but his brow line and the space just under his nose could do well with a bit of emphasis. What you just see me do is actually, or maybe you didn't see me do it, is apply a bit of paint like quite boldly, right, just below his nose, and then I take the brush and I sort of streak it on the surface to take most of the paint off, and then go in and feather it on. Because this is a wet palette, right, this really helps the paint dilute and become a bit more translucent, so you get a more subtle result. Yep. So you can kind of skip this step, to be perfectly honest, if all you're trying to achieve is a good tabletop standard miniature. But I find that this additional step of ice yellow plus scorpion green really makes the model much more attractive by essentially telegraphing to the viewer which areas to pay attention to, and it can make a big difference across a whole unit. Even if you only apply this, for example, to say the front rank of a unit, it can still have a huge effect on the way how complete the models look, and how visually eye-catching and how much they pop. Yep. So this guy is looking pretty good in my opinion. We are rapidly closing on the point where I would consider them ready for tabletop. And maybe only like refining and a bit more detail to come a bit later on, perhaps at a later date. You know, if I was rushing for a tabletop game, maybe like this would be pretty good already. But yeah, so what I'm going to do is kind of flit around the model, deciding where, you know, a little bit more emphasis might be needed. And actually that's a bit rough. Back of his hand stand to be blended in a little bit more, kind of like that. I think that's a bit better, although to be fair, yeah, sometimes it's possible to apply paint to a point where it starts to build up on the surface, and doesn't quite look, as smooth as it should be. In cases like these, I would suggest that you let it dry fully, and then like look at it after the paint has kind of leveled off and dried, and you've got something more, more final to work with, rather than worry too much about correcting it on the fly. So yeah, there we go. I think he's looking pretty good actually. Now the last thing I want to do to finish off the main surfaces is to give a black wash over the armor plates that I put on the model. So for this reason, I absolutely love the old noun oil mix. The old noun oil mix, which I've got over here. The old formulation for the Citadel Shade noun oil, in my opinion, was just a superior thing. The new formulation appears to be a little bit lackluster in terms of like color saturation. It's a lot weaker a mix, but I think that's all it is, insofar as you could correct the intensity quite easily by simply putting in a bit of Black Legion, like to mix a couple of drops of Black Legion into every new pot of noun oil that you use. Granted, it's an extra step and it's not ideal that Games Workshop adjusted it in a way that made the color less useful, but at the same time it's not really a deal ender. It's a fairly straightforward thing to adjust these colors. What I would like people to get used to is that you can basically adjust contrast paints to get them just the way you like them, rather than accepting what comes out of the bottle as is because you felt that for some reason it was intended to be used that way. I would like more painters to, in a way, take ownership, recognize that tools are tools, paints are just paints. They're just something that you paint with, and be a little bit more deliberate and a little bit more be a bit more thoughtful about the way we approach paints. This comes naturally, I feel, after a certain amount of painting, because you find that there are little problems with the way the paint is acting on the surface. Maybe it doesn't look quite right, maybe it's not quite giving you as much definition as you might want, and this comes naturally when we start to adjust it to our liking. It's these micro decisions that kind of make the process of painting a lot more pleasurable, and you reach a point where this eventually gets real fun, and you find that you can work fast and loose and still get a pretty decent result. I'm going to put a little bit of red into his eyes because that is how the orcs do. So orcs of this era had a tiny round eyeball, and not a lot much else, to be honest, as far as eye detail is concerned. I like to also take a bit of a darker shade. In this case, I'm using the noun oil puddle from before, and I'm just going to fill in his mouth. He's got teeth, but honestly they're really tiny, and even without picking them out, he looks pretty good already, although it feels like definitely we shouldn't leave that up, maybe for a future stage, but I don't know, I like the way he looks. So he's got these leather straps behind his knees. Ideally I would do that in a different color, just having a think about what color might work, because we've got the yellow brown, right, the Nazdreg yellow on his jerkin, so to speak, his vest, and then we've got the reddish brown already. We can't go further red because this club is extremely red. So perhaps we should go down Rattling Rhyme, which is more of a desaturated brown. So this is another color that I absolutely love to have in my arsenal. At first it looked pretty dull and nondescript and not very visually interesting, but in cases where, like I mentioned earlier, you want to have a section of leather that or a detail that you don't want to emphasize too much, you just want it to kind of recede and not visually clutter the model, this is a really good color to kind of let it still look like it's painted, still make it look like some attention was placed with it on it, but at the same time you don't necessarily need every single part of the model to be jumping out visually at you. In fact, that can look very distracting. And I think that kind of I think that kind of works. Going back to the green shading, I think I want to emphasize this area in between, and maybe a little bit more there. So when it comes to painting a model like this, like a single model, no real time pressure to complete a unit, I find that I have a tendency to flip from area to area, especially since I need to wait for parts of the model to dry. But this can be incredibly liberating when it comes to painting without putting pressure on yourself to have it finished within a certain amount of time, or to indeed meet a certain painting goal. Can be very liberating and comfortable, and I think this guy's starting to look pretty good. Oops, I didn't get a little bit. Yeah, when you make a mistake, when you have paint go on an area where it's not supposed to be, what I would do is to try to let it. If it's still wet, you can take paint. You can take a paintbrush. Just have it with a bit of water on it, and go over the surface quickly. And that really allows you to wick it off the surface if you're quick enough. Or else, not to worry, let it dry, and because you've got all the paints in front of you here, all the paints that you've been using up until this point, you can just touch it up on the spot and it should look just fine. So this guy is, oh, he's so cute. Now we've got ice yellow over here, so a tiny amount of this, and then that little pinprick in his eye socket. Now, don't know if, you know what, I'm just going to switch to a smaller brush. I thought for a moment maybe I'll do it with that size one, but since I've got one of these brushes which I happen to have lying around, which is a size 000, I'll use that instead of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So there we go, that's the eye on the right side and a little one on the left. Much easier, much less painful, I guess. Using the appropriate tool for the job really does wonders. And what else? I think maybe I want to pick out those teeth after all, because I think it would help to define the lower part of his face, which is looking a bit nondescript. Plus, you can kind of look at them when you sort of lean in. So I'm going to use pale sand. I don't foresee myself highlighting this. Probably just a little bit of pale sand with that same tiny brush, and kind of like painting the eye, sort of lean in, take a deep breath, then hold it, and then apply it like that. Don't worry if you make a mistake, it's just a case of coming back in and cleaning it up until you're happy with it. Now, one thing I always tell my students is the model's only done when you say it's done, right? You can keep coming back to touch it up as often as you need, and you only need stop when it's looking just the way you want it to look. The other thing is his toes. I'm not sure whether this model has toenails sculpted in, but you know what, I think it might be good to pick those out anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a nail bed of black on each of the toes. The fingernails you can't really see, so I think I'll just leave that as is. But I'm going to put a little bit of black on every toe, and then I'm going to put a bit of that bone color, that pale sand color on the surface. Can you see? Yeah, okay, good. Sorry, I was talking to myself just to try to make sure that this is in focus. I have actually done videos where I've done entire sections of the model with the whole figure off screen. Just brilliant. Yeah. And while we're letting that dry, perhaps what we'll do is we'll start to do a little something with the red to emphasize it. I'm taking a bit of Nuln oil, putting it into the transition point between the two colors, just to emphasize that a little bit more. Let's go with a bit of orange. So, light orange, great stuff. We've got a bit of red on our palette still, so I think we'll be able to mix that in and get a fairly decent highlight color. Aha! So when it comes to highlighting contrast paints, sometimes people get a bit too fixated on getting a color that's exactly the right color to highlight contrast paint. I would argue that you can mix contrast paint into other colors. So why not just use the contrast paint that you use as the basis of that highlight mix, just like you would with any other paint, as opposed to worrying about trying to pick up a citadel highlight, for example, that matches that color exactly. You don't need to do that. You can just use the contrast paint itself to mix that highlight. The only thing I would recommend that you would do is that if you're going to mix contrast paint as a highlight, as part of a highlight, I will make sure that the color that you use to lighten it is of a thicker consistency, right? Because contrast paint tends to be very watery. So if you go ahead and mix that into diluted paint, it's going to just create a puddle. Aha, I've made a mistake. So you see, on his arm, wet brush, clean water, and wipe it off. I hope you caught that. Yeah. So yeah, there we go. Our orc is looking really good. He's at a standard that I'm happy with. And I think I'm just going to rim his base, which is the most satisfying thing you'll ever see. Painting the base essentially around the edge. And then I think we'll call it a day. So I'm going to push this back and fetch my chosen base edge color and then get him to this standard, to a tabletop ready standard. So this is just like a Rhinox hide kind of color. Like that. And I'm just gonna go around the edge. I love this step. This step is so satisfying. And it's at this moment that I realize I haven't dotted his toenails. So I'll do that, not to worry. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten. And because this is an orc boy, it's taken us an hour or slightly less, hopefully. Slightly less than an hour. Woo! Dude, he is sprightly. Okay. Not cutting any of that out. It's part of the process. Mistakes aren't the end of the world. Okay. That's our boy. And now I'm going to very quickly try not to make a mess of our nice paint job so far. Go in and sort out his nails. So I'm going to bring that a bit closer. Three. 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Clean up that middle toenail. And he's done. Perfectly happy with this. Happy to put this on the gaming table. Might come back to him at some point in the future to spice him up a little bit. But for the most part, I think he looks pretty good. Considering we did this in one sitting. Let's move this away so you can see better. And he's a handsome boy. And hopefully he'll look real good with like maybe 50 friends with him. Yeah, there we go. So an hour. And if you like more of these kinds of videos, like, comment, subscribe, the usual. Tell me which era of miniatures you like the most. I like 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy. Tell me about your favorites. And I'll see you again tomorrow with another miniature. If you don't like orcs, we'll have something else different, I promise. Alright, have fun guys. Cheers.